Hi everybody, Jacob from Bryn Mawr Film Institute here. Our film this week is Wild River from 1960, directed by Elia Kazan. And we're going to be discussing this film at 6:30 p.m. on Monday, July 6th. If you'd like to learn more about this and other film studies opportunities, please visit us on the web at brynmarfilm.org. So, during the 1940s and 50s, Elia Kazan was one of America's preeminent directors, both on stage and on the screen. And he made a number of classic movies, including A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, East of Eden, and the list goes on and on. Kazan was also one of the great directors of actors. In 1947, he had helped found the Actors Studio, which was a famous workshop that was one of the first places in America to teach the technique that we call method acting. And indeed, many of the Hollywood stars that we think of as early method actors trained at the Actors Studio. This includes people like Marlon Brando and James Dean, both of whom, coincidentally, had their breakthrough roles in Kazan productions. Now, during the 1930s, Kazan had briefly been a member of the Communist Party, although he'd been kicked out fairly quickly and subsequently became disillusioned with communism. And so, in the 1950s, in 1952 to be precise, as America was sort of at the height of its Red Scare fervor, Kazan appeared as a friendly witness before the House Committee of Un-American Activities and gave up the names of several former colleagues. Now, this would be a pivotal incident in Kazan's life. Not only would his testimony loom over his reputation until his death, but it also marked a sort of dividing line in his film work. Prior to his testimony, most of Kazan's film projects had originated with the studios and had been offered to him. But following his testimony, his films took a more personal turn, and Kazan involved himself more in developing his projects from their inception. And so Wild River is one of these post-testimony films. It's set in the 1930s, in the early days of FDR's New Deal, and it focuses particularly on the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. And this was a government body that built a network of dams along the Tennessee River. And the object was not just to control the river's destructive flooding, but also to revitalize and to modernize the Tennessee Valley, which was mostly agrarian and had been hard hit by the Depression. In the film, Montgomery Clift plays a TVA bureaucrat who arrives in Tennessee from the east, and he's come to try to convince an old woman named Ella Garth to sell her land. Now, this is land that she and her family have lived on for generations, but it's due to be flooded in a few weeks when the TVA activates a new dam. The general outcome is never much in doubt. We understand that the dam will eventually become operational, that the land will be flooded, and that Ella Garth will have to leave. But Clift's character hopes to avoid the negative spectacle of removing her by force, and this is sort of the core drama of the film. Now, Montgomery Clift and Elia Kazan had a bit of history. Clift had been an early member of the Actors Studio, and though he didn't consider himself strictly a method actor, Clift was perhaps the first, let's say, method-influenced actor to become a major Hollywood star, this being a few years before Marlon Brando. However, in 1956, Clift was involved in a serious car accident, which not only altered his previously angelic good looks, but also led him into a substance problem, which would eventually result in his death. And so by the time of Wild River, Clift was already starting to be seen as an actor in decline. That said, he was still probably the biggest name in the film, but in my opinion, he is more than equaled by his female co-stars. That includes Jo Van Fleet, who plays Ella Garth. If you can believe it, Van Fleet was only in her 40s when she played this role. She convincingly plays an octogenarian. There's also Lee Remick, who in my opinion gives the film's greatest performance as Carol Garth, Montgomery Clift's eventual love interest. Remick had also trained at the Actors Studio, and she had in fact made her film debut in 1957 in Kazan's previous film, A Face in the Crowd. Now, I want to mention one more figure who doesn't appear on screen much, but is nonetheless a person of some significance, and that is the actress Barbara Loden. Now, we'll see Loden in the film briefly in a bit part as Montgomery Clift's secretary, and she would go on to have a brief but accomplished career as an actress and a director. Now, at the time of Wild River, Kazan and Loden were involved in an affair. They would eventually marry. And Loden, who had been raised in rural North Carolina, acted as a sort of informal advisor on the film with regard to its depiction of country life. Now, many people speculate that Loden was the inspiration for the character Carol Garth, played by Lee Remick, so keep an eye out for her in the movie. So how does Wild River fit into Kazan's overall filmography? Well, I would argue that it is in some ways typical of Kazan's work, but it is atypical in some crucial ways too. So let's unpack that a little bit. In Wild River, we will see Kazan's ongoing interest in depicting the lives of common people, especially in the American South. And this was a career-long preoccupation for Kazan. Early in his directing career, he had declared, "I want to make folk movies, not folksy movies." You'll notice, too, that the individual drama in Wild River is braided into larger social questions. And this is also a through line in Kazan's work. Kazan was once described as being in a lover's quarrel with his country, and many of his films tackled social issues that were pressing in American life, things like racism and anti-Semitism and corruption and so forth. Now, some critics have noted that in Kazan's post-testimony films, the theme of betrayal seems to come up an awful lot. And perhaps one of the things that we can touch on in our discussion is whether or not that comes to bear in Wild River, and if so, how. Now, as I mentioned, there are ways in which Wild River is atypical for Kazan as well. Firstly, you'll notice this in the film's tone. If you've seen Kazan films like A Streetcar Named Desire, or especially A Face in the Crowd, you know that many of his films have this sort of bombast or theatricality to them. We're not really going to see that in Wild River. This is a movie with a much more mellow mood, a more subdued tone, and Montgomery Clift's character is sort of unusually hesitating for a Kazan protagonist. By the same token, the film's moral stance is much more ambiguous. Now, this is not to say that Kazan's other films were ham-handed or simple-minded. They aren't. But there's usually a clear sense of what is right and what is wrong. And in Wild River, Kazan seems to actively work to confound this. The film really digs into the tension between some of the core drives in the American spirit. We see this sort of notion of rugged individualism that comes up against the idea of society-wide pursuit of common good. And Kazan also plays with America's sort of push-pull relationship between tradition and progress. And we're going to see these themes play out not just in the A plot, which concerns the land and eminent domain, but also in the B plot, concerning the relationship between the characters played by Montgomery Clift and Lee Remick. And we'll even see it percolate down to the film's visual language. Notice the way that Kazan alternates between close-up shots of his characters, which force us to confront them as individuals, and mid or long shots, which show them in the context of their environments and force us to see them in a larger context. So even in the film's formal style, Kazan is sort of underscoring these thematic tensions. Now, Wild River was made by 20th Century Fox, who were baffled by the film, and they gave it a very minor release, and subsequently it was not seen by that many people. And it still hasn't been widely seen. But there's a camp that considers Wild River one of Kazan's best films, if not his best, period. So one way or another, I think it's very much worth checking out. Not only is it an interesting installment in the career of an important director, but it's an interesting look at American life, a uniquely American film, I think. So I hope you will check out the film. It is available on most rent-to-stream platforms. And again, we'll be discussing the film at 6:30 p.m. on Monday, July 6th. I hope to see you there.